So today's presentation will be led by students. So from after Mike Knox's introductory comments, Aiden and Jessica will lead the whole presentation.
Okay, Mansuk, should we begin?
Yes, sir.
Okay, class, I hope you're ready. Welcome back. Final project presentation today. Just a couple of introductory comments. Obviously, the United States and Russia, the Soviet Union, have had nuclear arms control agreements in effect pretty much without interruption from 1972 with the signing of SALT I right till today, with New START expected to expire next February. And your project has been to examine alternatives after the end of that treaty. Please, when you present the findings of each group, speak slowly, clearly, and loudly, and speak with feeling. Just don't read material without any emotion. Try to make your case, okay? So we're all looking forward to hearing from you, and hopefully you'll allow a little time for questions at the end, and we'll end at 3:30. Professor Van Bibber, anything you'd like to add?
No comments on my end. I think that was an excellent introduction, Michael. So I think we can begin.
All right, Austin, you want to take over here?
I believe the logistics team is going to run the introduction and get everything started, so I'll let them take it away.
Let me real quick share my screen. 1 second. Everyone can see this? All right. Let me begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for taking time today to sit through this. I know it'll be a longish production today, but I definitely think based on everything I've seen from every single group, that this will be well worth the effort, especially with the current issues that we're facing. Currently, the biggest issue in the news continues to be COVID-19. Rightfully considered one of the major events in recent history, it shadows many other important issues. However, while a pandemic will tax the world resources and cause substantial damage in both the loss of human life and economic productivity, the issue of nuclear warfare should not be forgotten. The potential catastrophic effects of an unabated nuclear arms race could seriously harm long-term efforts for peace. Therefore, with the expiration of New START looming on the horizon, the issue of renewal is pressing, especially since this is the last major piece of nuclear arms control that remains in place between the United States and the Russian Federation. The long arc of multilateral arms reduction is to prevent the potential creation of nuclear war. While this possibility has seemed dimmer over the decades, especially since the only use of nuclear weapons was at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it should never be dismissed as a possibility, one that would potentially destroy much of each nation's progress and could spell out the final sentence of the human population. The decisions we make as we approach different pieces of arms reductions could seriously harm or alter the future for those who will inherit this earth from us. The report presented today is one that thoroughly examines a multitude of reasons that the New START II treaty should be renewed. It also addresses questions regarding the involvement of China in a new treaty, the different technologies that should be considered for future arms control, and the long arc of American strategic arms control efforts. The importance of this paper rests in its ability to accurately describe a multitude of different potential paths for the future of New START 2. Answers will be provided to many of the common questions, such as if China should be involved in the treaty. Should different weapons be considered to be added to the agreement? Will it even be possible to complete this treaty before it expires? The goal then is to ensure that the reader and the listener today has an opportunity to become well acquainted with the different potential paths the United States has to take. The report that you are about to hear originated out of the class Nuclear Security, the Nexus Between Policy and Technology at the University of California, Berkeley in spring 2020. The overall goal of this class was to divide into individual sections tasked with studying a particular aspect of the New START Treaty. The editors, me and Jessica Elder, have attempted to ensure that the order of the presentation today will be the best for easy listening. I now turn it over to my fellow member, Jessica Elder.
Thank you, Aiden. We'll first begin our presentations with the historical team, who will give us a brief overview of past nuclear arms control treaties, as well as the current standing of today's soon expiring New START treaty. This group's work will give us the historical context needed to properly understand current relations between our countries of interest. Next, we'll move over into the diplomatic and economic team. This team will provide us with information on diplomatic challenges that made multilateral nuclear arms reduction treaties difficult to implement. The findings of this group are crucial towards the future of New START, as major setbacks or distrust between two nations can quickly derail a multi-year effort to move forward. After that, we'll hear from our strategic and military team, who will give us an overview on the strategic military implications of all options for the treaty. They'll also provide us with US, Russian, and Chinese perspectives with respect to their current international relations, and we'll discuss how the potential for hybrid war has important implications towards our decision to renew. Next, we'll hear from our technical team, who will summarize arsenal reduction, limits, and verification methods imposed by the current treaty, as well as US, Russian, and Chinese nuclear capabilities. Modernization of weaponry suggests a need to amend the treaty throughout its lifetime to include these emerging technologies. And finally, we'll hear from our recommendations team, who will give us a holistic viewpoint of how the US should proceed. Their findings will consider all information previously presented by their peers and will explore the pros and cons of all plausible options. The future of New START will directly impact our standing with major world powers and will affect overall global stability. We hope you find the work presented both thought-provoking and interesting. And we'd now like to turn it over to the historical team, who will start us off.
Hi, hello everyone. This is Andrew Dong from the historical group, and this is what my group mates and I did this semester for the project. Next slide, please. Okay. For the historical introduction, I created two timelines, the first of which lists out all the major nuclear agreements and treaties since the inception of the nuclear age, both international and more bilateral in nature. From this, we can see that the global landscape has changed substantially. As a brief overview, international efforts have focused more on curtailing proliferation and the use of nuclear weapons, while more bilateral US, USSR/Russian efforts have focused more on limiting and subsequently reducing their respective nuclear arsenals. Next slide, please. The second timeline takes a more detailed look into the more bilateral nuclear agreements between the US and USSR/Russia. From these agreements and their respective milestones, we can see a very wide range of paths from start to finish. Some were relatively quick and straightforward, others were significantly delayed, as indicated by long faded portions in their timeline, and still others straight up failed, indicated by explosion symbols at the end. Overall, what can be learned is that there are many avenues for things to derail an agreement, be it content disagreements during the discussion phase, the signings of the head of states, ratifications of the respective legislative bodies, and external events. The key of the historical perspective is that the lessons of the past will help us predict what to expect in the path we choose, in this case, for New START. Now I'll hand it over to Hugh, who will go into more detail about the talks that started it all. Start one.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon. My name is Hugh Simmons. Events leading to the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT. In the 1960s, the US gained intelligence that the Soviet Union, Socialist Republic, USSR, had embarked on a massive intercontinental ballistic build in order to maintain nuclear capacity with the United States. This news, among other issues, brought concerns to the administration and caused President Johnson to call for talks. Johnson's successor, President Richard Nixon, also believed in an agreement needed to be made with the Soviet Union. And in 1969, another round of formal talks in Helsinki, Finland began. This treaty is the first time during the Cold War the US and the USSR had agreed to limit the number of nuclear missiles in their arsenal. SALT I is considered a crowning achievement in the Nixon-Kissinger-Dante strategy. Next slide, please. SALT I is signed by President Nixon and Brezhnev on May 26, 1972. Next slide, please. Negotiations for additional treaties began in 1972 almost immediately after SALT I was signed. These additional negotiations transpired over the next 3 administrations, lasting until 1979. An agreement of equal number ICBMs and SLBMs created some parity between the two nations, which was lacking from the initial SALT treaty. Next slide, please. An agreement in 1979 in the Vienna Summit, the treaty achieved numerical equality between the two nations in terms of delivery systems and MIRVs. The SALT treaty was never ratified in the Senate, due in large part to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan 6 months after the agreement was signed in 1979. President Carter withdrew the treaty from the Senate in 1980 because of this. Ronald Reagan agreed to adhere to the SALT II treaty despite his critical views and would pursue a strategic arms reduction treaty, the START, initiated originally as SALT III. Next slide. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty was an arms control treaty between the United States and the Soviet Union with President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. It was signed in 1987 with Senate approval in 1988 and ratified in 1988 as well. Next slide. The withdrawal of the treaty was in 2019 as seen by the Trump administration because of Russia's non-compliance with the development of the SSC-8 with the range in violation of the INF treaty. Russia also claims it was not in violation of the treaty and accuses the United States for deployment of anti-ballistic interceptors in the region as well. This is a violation of the compliance. Many people in the administration feel that the treaty was unilaterally bound the U.S. and is seen as outdated treaty and constrains the U.S. defense options. Next slide.
All right. So START I originated in the Reagan administration and was a radical proposal at the time, as it called not just to limit, but actively reduce nuclear stockpiles.
Who is speaking now?
Oh, sorry, this is Alex Christensen. Significant difficulties dragged out START I's negotiations as the original proposal placed the Soviet Union at a significant disadvantage. This was further exacerbated by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Despite these difficulties, however, START I was eventually ratified by both the United States and the 4 successor states to the USSR, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, and went on to become one of the most successful arms control treaties in history. Over its 15-year lifetime, the US nuclear stockpile was reduced by more than a factor of 3. Next slide, please. START II had an even harder negotiations period. It was signed in 1993, just 2 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the threat of global nuclear war was still on everyone's minds. However, over the course of the next decade, this threat became less and less relevant. Ratification was drawn out by the Russian Duma numerous times, first in 1998 due to American and British airstrikes in Iraq, and then the following year due to American involvement in NATO bombings of Kosovo during the Yugoslavian Civil War. Relations between the United States and Russia further deteriorated that year during the first NATO expansion to include former Soviet bloc countries Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. When Russia finally ratified the treaty in 2000, they made it contingent on the preservation of the ABM Treaty. Following American withdrawal of the ABM Treaty in 2002, the Russians withdrew from START II. While negotiations for START II were stalled out, the groundwork for START III was being laid. Although never being ratified, START III eventually became the groundwork for the New START Treaty. The key takeaway from the success and failure of both START I and START II is that the longer a negotiation period, the greater chance global events have of derailing them. Now, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Yves, who is going to go over the New START Treaty.
Hi, I am Yves, and I will talk about the New START Treaty. So, New START is the only bilateral nuclear treaty that is still in force today between the US and Russia. It was initiated in 2009 when Presidents Medvedev and Obama during the G20 announced their desire to create a new treaty. After 6 months and 9 rounds of negotiations, an agreement has been found on November 9, and New START was then signed in April 2010. The US ratification by Obama happened on February 2nd of 2011 after the presentation of New START and the Senate approval. For Russia, Medvedev ratified it on January 28th after its approval by the State Duma. The treaty will expire on February 2021 and could be extended for 5 more years. So at its initiation in 2009, thanks to the treaties that were presented earlier, the stockpiles were at their minimum since decades on both sides. However, there were still some points of tensions between the two states. First, so examples of this are the Iranian and North Korean nuclear threats and the American project of installing an anti-missile system in Europe that was not really appreciated by the Russians. The Russian invasion in 2008 of South Ossetia in Georgia, condemned this time by the US, also increased the tensions. But in this context, 3 main reasons motivated the creation of the new treaty. First, START I ended in 2009, while START II and III never entered into force, and START was ending in 2012 and did not include any verification obligation. So this situation raised the fear of an unlimited numbers of offensive weapons and a verification gap where there is no transparency from one state to the other. Then Obama made the nuclear weapon question one of the key points of its project, while Russia was seeing the negotiation of nuclear treaties as a sign of its status as a world power. Treaties between the US and Russia are also a good sign of a continuing effort of warming relations since the Cold War. Finally, the significant costs of a new nuclear arms race had to be avoided. So, looking at the negotiation process, it appears clear that it has been quite successful. First, the desire of finding quickly an agreement has been fulfilled. The treaty also set a limit on both the number of warheads and delivery systems, which was wanted by the Russians, while the anti-missile plan has been given up by Obama to help the negotiations. Then a link between offensive and defensive systems has been acknowledged in the New START preamble, and the deployment of nuclear weapons has been limited to national territories. Finally, Russia accepted inspection rules that were more constraining than ever. So here, the most important points of this agreement have been taken into account, and both parties came into an agreement pretty quickly without many obstacles. In Russia, like in the US, the project has not suffered from a strong opposition and received significant support. But even in this case, that was close to be ideal, almost 2 years passed from announcement to ratification, which gives a probable lower limit for future treaties. It also highlighted the importance of external factors on those bilateral treaties, like here North Korea or Iran, that are still relevant questions today. So now I will hand it off to Christian, who will talk about the relations between the US and Russia since the New START Treaty and the case of China.
Thanks, Eve. Good morning, everyone. This is Christian Sclafani, and I'm going to talk briefly about the evolution of the relationship between the US and Russia. There have been various tensions between the two states since the inception of the New START Treaty, especially in 2014, when the US deployed Aegis warships off the coast of Spain as a part of the European Missile Defense Initiative, which Russia considered to violate the INF Treaty, and again later that year with Russia's annexation of Crimea, when the United States placed sanctions against Russia to pressure them into returning control to the Ukraine. And then finally in 2019, when both parties withdrew from the INF Treaty. Despite these conflicts, the New START Treaty has been an overall success. During this time, communication between the two states has increased, routine inspections and verifications of arms have been conducted, and each state has continued to decrease their deployed delivery systems and warheads. You can see in the table on the right, the number of deployed delivery systems for both states has approximately been cut in half, from nearly 2,000 between the two states to just over 1,100, where the number of warheads has dramatically decreased from nearly 10,000 down to about 2,700 for both states. Next slide, please. Which brings us to China, who is a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And despite not being a signatory to any test ban treaties, they have adhered to all test banning treaties very closely and continue to maintain a strict no first use of nuclear weapons posture. Although China is making efforts to modernize their delivery systems, their estimated arsenal of 290 nuclear warheads remains well under the limitations put into effect under the New START Treaty. And to involve them in negotiations at this time would only create unnecessary complications. I'll hand it back to Andrew now, who will deliver our conclusions.
Thanks, Christian. From the historical perspective, we can determine three main conclusions regarding the future of New START. The first of which is that ideally, we should draft and enact a new New START. The nuclear landscape has changed since New START was first enacted, and new and potentially future nuclear systems may not be adequately accounted for. In general, the historical perspective has indicated that if the opportunity exists to do so, we should modernize a strategic arm reduction treaty. Next slide, please. At the very least, however, we should extend New START, which can also be viewed as a way to buy time for drafting a new treaty. From the historical perspective, it is likely that there's not enough time for a new START, and thus extending the current New START should be stressed. Since SALT I, there has historically never been a major gap in treaties regarding nuclear arsenals between the US and Russia. Once New START expires, the only remaining bilateral treaty is the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, which doesn't address nuclear arsenals specifically. If New START were to expire with no replacement, both parties may continue to abide by its clauses, like in the case of SALT II, but it is uncertain if and how long this may be the case, and thus it is paramount to at least extend New START to mitigate any potential for escalation. Next slide, please. Finally, we should not involve China in a near future treaty. Historically, China has respected the clauses of treaties and at this time do not have an arsenal meriting inclusion. Involving China now would only make the negotiation process more complex and likely longer. Exploration into the involvement of China, however, should be deferred to a later time. And this concludes the historical conclusions. Thanks everyone for listening, and if there's any time, we'll take any questions.
Thank you, historical team. We actually have time for one question. Any questions? All right, well then I would like to hand it off to our economic and diplomatic team.
Baby comic noise and presenting. Hello everyone, we are the economic and diplomatic team and we want to thank you all for the exciting semester and collaboration throughout this period. We are very happy to show you today our key findings. I am Tatiana Sierra Feras and the rest of our team members are.
I'm Juhi and I'm a nuclear engineering student.
I'm Rithika. I'm an undergrad studying data science.
I'm Christian, a nuclear engineering undergrad.
And this is Lorenzo Vergari, PhD student in nuclear engineering.
Today, our presentation will start with explaining our diplomatic and economic methodology, and then our key diplomatic and economic findings for three separate categories: renewing the treaty as is, signing an amendment treaty, not renewing the treaty at all. Then we're going to go on to present briefly the introduction of other nuclear states in the treaty, and we'll finish our presentation with our conclusions and recommendations.
Hi, everyone. I'm Juhi. And so any treaty between nations has economic and diplomatic implications. The New START treaty is between the USA and Russia, and our team considered economic and diplomatic variables before we made our final recommendation. This included US and Russia relations, global arms control, impacts on deterrence, budget and control, and maintenance and research costs and savings. Should we renew the treaty as is with modifications, which would include the type and number of weapons or delivery vehicles, or should we not renew it at all? After considering these variables and options, our conclusions found that renewing bilaterally, or renewing as is, was the best option for now. In the future, this treaty can be updated and a more detailed or complex agreement can be formulated.
This is Rithika, and the first thing that we did before we delved into the possible options of this treaty is we first looked at the methodology both on the diplomatic and economic side. So on the diplomatic side, as our world becomes increasingly more connected and dynamic as well as complex, there are a lot of different power dynamics and considerations that must be taken into place going into any type of negotiation. Especially because there's a lot of different sensitive subjects. So our diplomatic methodology was put into 3 different frameworks. First, the current state of US and Russia relations. While they've worked together as of recently on many treaties and agreements with regards to nuclear proliferation, there have also been concerns. For example, the recent US elections, the Syrian conflict, and the INF treaty withdrawal in 2019. So looking at this relationship between the 2 countries, especially now with the time of COVID-19 and the uncertainties it introduces into that relationship, is important. Second, we looked at the global dynamics with the United States. So the United States' relationship with all of the other countries, especially countries that have nuclear powers and nuclear considerations, especially because the US's presence can sometimes have a reactionary stance, or other countries rely on the US's protection. And there have been a lot of concerns or accusations going forward, particularly with this administration. And third, looking at kind of the same thing, but global dynamics with Russia. So Russia's relationships with different global powers that need to be factored in or considered. And this includes Russia's presence, as well as some of its invasionary tactics, or countries that are just susceptible to Russian influence in general.
This is Lorenzo. On the economic perspective, we started to assess what's the budget for nuclear defense for the next 10 years, and we tried to identify what are the main cost items in that. At this point, we started a differential analysis in which we tried to highlight expenses and savings that might arise with having a different strategy than renewing the treaty as is. So we started to consider an updated treaty and try to amount the savings that could be achieved when reducing the arsenal size. On the other end, we tried to find some facts that show that reduction of the arsenal size due to previous historical landscapes allow for a reduction on economic terms as well. Finally, we tried to assess a scenario in which the treaty is not renewed and try to quantify what's the impact of the arms race that might derive from that, and see how relevant it is, even considering the COVID-19 insurgence.
Now we're going to talk about renewing the treaty as is. When it comes to the diplomatic aspects of renewing the treaty, we have found that the US has expressed a valid interest to include other nuclear states in the treaty, such as China, and renegotiate further arms reduction and include maybe tactical weapons. On the other hand, Russia seems to be willing to sign the extension of the New START treaty as soon as possible, but if only the US agrees. The US seems to postpone further discussions and play for time in order to be able to succeed to address their concerns. This can be dangerous though. As Eve mentioned in the previous presentation, New START treaty is the only major nuclear arms control treaty between Russia and the US. And as Rithika mentioned earlier, the current relations between the 2 countries are very unstable. One of the benefits of renewing the treaty is that it can stabilize these relations and begin a new era of agreements. This will send a message to allies, which could also help with future arms control negotiation and international cooperation, which we'll see it's very important, especially in the time of COVID. This renewal can secure also that the US has a power and has strengthened its position as a mediator and key deterrent with other nuclear states, such as India, Pakistan, and North Korea. As we all know, the New START treaty is expiring in a few months. and so time is a very serious constraint for the renewal. If the New START treaty is renewed, the US can gain valuable time to invest in nuclear modernization, and both states can renegotiate a more comprehensive treaty. In the meantime, access to on-site inspection will still be allowed, and an arms race will be deterred. Lastly, other states like China can prepare both technologically and logistically to enter a new, more comprehensive treaty.
This is Juhi again. So let's look at renewing the treaty as is from an economical perspective. The United States is expected to spend a total of $494 billion in the next 10 years for maintenance and modernization of its nuclear defense. The New START treaty verification regime allows for inspections, which totals to 18 inspections a year, and use of a national technical means, which is abbreviated as NTM. Recent estimates on the NTM's related expenses are not available. So the most recent resource available shows that the US national NTM related cost amounted to $4.95 billion in 1990 dollars. So assuming a similar cost for their updated versions and correcting for inflation, we can estimate that NTM related expenses would amount to $9.8 billion. With regards to on-site inspections, the most recent resource that we have is from 1998, and it reports a cost of $40 million per year. In 1998, the US was a signatory of START 1, which allowed for 12 inspections per year. So assuming a similar cost per inspection and correcting for inflation again, the on-site inspection cost amounts to $155 million per year. Costs and budgets have already been established for the upcoming decade for the maintenance and modernization of the nuclear defense force.
We're now going to talk about signing an amendment treaty. Renewing the treaty with minor changes includes the negotiation of further arms reduction and a more detailed definition of strategic and tactical weapons. This seems to be in particular interest of the US, which has undertaken only a limited effort to modernize their arms, but Russia has ramped up the development of new generation strategic delivery vehicles. The US is concerned about those new Russian technologies, such as the Sarmat ICBM and Avanguard HGV, and more. In order to move forward the discussions, Russia has assured that these systems are going to be part of the New START treaty extension, which is technologically valid. Other Russian weapons of concern of the US are not going to be deployed until 2027, which is basically a year after the extension expires if the treaty is extended. We have also found that significant reduction in numbers of weapons are not of interest for any of the two countries. What we also need to take into account is that it is a very long and difficult process, and it doesn't seem to be feasible until the New START treaty expires. If the treaty is not signed for this reason, it can lead to a serious new arms race.
This is Juhi again. So let's look at signing an amended treaty from the economics perspective. So the US arsenal has never heavily relied on tactical weapons. These have always been limited in number with respect to Russia. As a result, if the US and Russia signed a more comprehensive arms control treaty, controlling tactical weapons and new types of delivery vehicles, the new treaty would only have a reduced economic impact for the US. On the other hand, a reduction in the US nuclear defense expenses may arise if the limit of deployable warheads and delivery systems was lowered. Nevertheless, the savings might be modest. For example, CBO estimates that reducing the total deployed warheads from 1,550 to 1,000 would lead to a total saving of only $17 billion in 10 years, which is only less than 4% of the planned budget. This observation is in line with historical data. Despite the New START treaty causing a 75% reduction in the number of deployed warheads and delivery vehicles, the overall budget was not affected greatly, but has continued to be a steady percentage of the total defense spending.
Hi everyone, this is Christian. So this is an analysis of amending the treaty to include China. This analysis could also apply for any other states that were considered to be included as well. So some of the major challenges on the diplomatic side are creating a balanced incentive structure due to the smaller nuclear arsenals. It's pretty likely that any reduction in size for these other states that would be included could ultimately make their deterrence capabilities obsolete. We also look to maintain regional and global stability for parties involved. Now, one of the major considerations is something like China and Russia leveraging their combined negotiating power, similar to how they do at the United Nations Security Council, to achieve similar goals should China be involved. And ultimately, we would want to prevent any arms race for states that aren't involved in the treaty. So if the United States and Russia were to significantly reduce their arsenal as an incentive for a state like China to join, other states could increase their arsenal size by a significantly smaller amount and still have a comparable number of nuclear weapons. From an economic standpoint, again, something like a 25% arsenal reduction reduces the budget only by $17 billion. So the incentive of reducing our own, as well as Russia's nuclear arsenal, isn't necessarily very economically savvy. In terms of inspection costs, you could probably assume that, again, it's just going to cost an extra $155 million per inspection per state. And lastly, the NTM costs would likely increase for all parties. And new states to join would pretty likely also have a heavier investment into the NTM technology since they don't have the infrastructure built that the United States and Russia do.
This is Rithika, and I think the last thing that we wanted to consider was, although there are a lot of potential benefits to renewing New START, or even considering renewing New START with certain amendments, it's important to understand the diplomatic advantages and economic advantages or disadvantages if we were not to renew the treaty. Looking at the diplomatic side, the precedent for this withdrawal was kind of set by the United States back in 2019 when they withdrew from the INF treaty withdrawal, as talked about by the historical group. So the US withdrew from the INF treaty, citing that they had concerns over Russia violating this treaty. And although Russia has not necessarily violated New START, it's important to consider that when negotiating or continuing a deal with the party, we should uphold agreements only with negotiators who are negotiating in good faith, which means we should have trust that Russia will uphold the agreement or the renewal. And given the recent INF concerns, it's important to consider that they might not. And second, the other important part with that is that nuclear modernization is occurring regardless of whether or not these treaties are signed, just outside of the bounds of the treaty right now. The second and possibly most important point is that right now, the biggest concern in terms of global stability and safety is not necessarily a potential arms race between the United States and Russia, but rather the rising threats of other global powers, regional conflicts, or non-rational state powers. So this includes the development of nuclear capabilities by other countries that can be a bigger threat to Russia or the United States than our own arsenal modifications. Along with this, having a lot of global turmoil, especially given the current conflicts, having a strong nuclear arsenal is not only beneficial for the United States, but also we should focus our political capital and resources on other development and military modernization. And third, depending on how the agreement goes, it can undermine US presence in deterring hostile actors if their arsenal, if their modernization is not up to speed with other countries. And then third, rather than focusing on renewing New START or considering different amendments to New START, the current administration in particular is very much in favor of a completely new nuclear agreement. So this multilateral agreement wouldn't necessarily be focused on Russia or the United States, but more so looking on limiting the powers or nuclear capabilities of more rising global conflicts such as China or India and Pakistan, along with preventing other countries from getting nuclear powers.
From the economic perspective, we expect that not renewing the treaty can cause an increase in the arsenal size of both the US and the Russian Federation. We expect this increase to be limited, nevertheless, because as of now, we see that despite the number of deployed warheads and delivery vehicles is close to the limit, the number of non-deployed one is not increasingly large. So what we did is simulating a scenario with just a limited 10% increase in the number of weapons, and we scaled up all other costs for nuclear defenses accordingly. So we consider an aggressive policy for research and development and innovation of the arsenal. We also consider an increase in the Minuteman tests rate and also an increase in the cost for communication, command and control, because we expect the United States to be looking for a more reliable arsenal in case there is no treaty standing. we subtracted the cost for inspections, and we also increased the expenses that might be due to a loss of the economic stability with Russian federations and allied states in terms of exports related to nuclear, but not to weapons. And the result was that we predict that a 10% increase in the weapons would lead to more than 60 billion of additional expenses, nuclear-related expenses, the next 10 years. And when we consider that the overall impact of COVID-19 on the US economy is of more than 2 trillion, we really think that this might discourage the United States to go towards this path. And in the light of all the aspects, and also including the stance of the Russian Federation, we tried to draw a conclusion and recommendations from the economic and diplomatic perspectives. Starting from the Russian Federation, we saw that the increase in military spending from 2019 has been large, 57%. And also, when we go and consider what's the total expenses for nuclear defense in Russia, and we correct that with the GDP, we saw that this figure of merit is 4 times larger than in the US. Moreover, as it was mentioned earlier, the Russian Federation is superior to the United States in tactical weapons and has already been developing a very aggressive plan of modernization. That led us to believe that the Russian Federation is not willing to renegotiate the treaty and to have a lower limit on the number of weapons or a more technical definitions of the weapons that included that. But there have been signs by Russian Federation that the renewal of the New START treaty would be an appreciated move.
This is Christian again. So ultimately, our conclusion and recommendation is that the best move in terms of a diplomatic and economic standpoint is a 5-year New START renewal. This would create a more globally stable nuclear security system. Without the inclusion of other states, there is, due to the shorter time span that this treaty would be enacted for, there would be the opportunity to include more states at the end. Due to the COVID-19 induced economic instability, the lack of increased costs by a significant margin allows this treaty to be favorable. And lastly, over the next 10 years, we've already allocated $500 billion in our budget for the maintenance and the upkeep of the nuclear arsenal. And that would happen regardless of the treaty's outcome. So ultimately, this is the most economic and diplomatically savvy solution. So again, our recommendation is a 5-year New START renewal.
Well, thank you, economic and diplomatic team. That was very informative. We would now like to move on to the strategic military team.
Good afternoon. My name is Benjamin Hicks, and I will be leading us into the Military and Strategy Group's findings. Next slide, please. So we will present and deliver summaries of key positions and questions on the strategic interests related to the expiration of the New START treaty from the United States' perspective, Russia's perspective, potentially China's perspective, discuss a little bit about how US strategic credibility has changed over the last 20 years, and consider how things like hybrid technologies, a hybrid war, and coronavirus will affect military and strategic thinking around nuclear weapons. Next slide, please. So starting with the United States' perspective in the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review, the US is committed to reducing its weapons and reducing the number of weapons globally, of nuclear weapons as well as biological, chemical, and other types of WMDs. It maintains that we don't seek adversarial relationships with China or Russia and are moving towards a WMD-free world. Russia and China, however, have been developing those technologies and building arsenals and alternatives for nuclear weapon delivery that extend beyond the New START treaty. The United States needs to maintain its nuclear force and will have a continued reliance on nuclear weapons for deterrence. The goal of nuclear weapons for the United States is to deter nuclear and non-nuclear threats, to assure allies and partners. And with that comes the ability to keep other countries from developing nuclear weapons because they know that the United States could be a strong ally and that they have a nuclear capability. And so it discourages the proliferation of nuclear weapons. The achievement of US objectives if deterrence fails. There are other actors out there in the world that are threatened by nuclear weapons and may instigate conflict, and the US still needs that nuclear force for potential retaliation, even though it is seeking the reduction of nuclear weapons. And the capacity to hedge against an uncertain future. Once again, having nuclear weapons creates a certain extended talking point that both Russia and China have with the United States. Next, he will talk about the Russian perspective.
You're on mute.
Hugh is presenting now.
Evo, he seems to be on mute. He's the one sharing the presentation, though.
Sorry, my bad. Let me start again. So there are three major factors that influence Russia's perspective, in our opinion. The first factor is the mutual distrust between the US and its US, NATO, and Russia. So in the last decade, US and NATO believe that Russia is trying to expand its field of influence by citing example that Russia has been making threats toward neighboring country if they want to join NATO. And Russia's action in Crimea make this assumption very credible. However, repeatedly, Russian top officials deny these allegations and state that Russia does not have a nuclear first use policy and does not intend to expand its influence. And they claim that any Russian involvement in other countries can be justified as defending its national security. However, the US expressed its doubt, and in the Nuclear Posture Review, the US characterized Russia's nuclear strategy as escalate to de-escalate. That means that in an event of a regional conflict, Russia would threaten to use tactical nuclear weapons to deter the US and NATO from any military involvement. Furthermore, from the viewpoint of Russia, Russia argued that US involvement in Iraq and Libya is its way of expanding NATO influence, and they feel threatened. Furthermore, the US intention to develop low-yield tactical nuclear weapons indicates that the US is prepared to fight a regional nuclear war. And in the last 2 decades, together with the mutual distrust, the nuclear modernization program in Russia has been the front and center of Russia's nuclear strategy. And the program was triggered by the US withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and is further reinforced by the Prompt Global Strike effort. We can see that in the 2018 annual address, Putin has dedicated about half of his address on announcing the major developments reflecting Russia's commitment toward fighting a potential nuclear war at all length scales. Some of the examples are nuclear powered cruise missile with unlimited range, nuclear armed hypersonic boost glide vehicle that has the potential to bypass US ABM system, the Sarmat ICBM, and furthermore, they want to increase the number of tactical non-strategic nuclear weapons. And lastly, Russia does not just focus on fighting nuclear war, but recently they have been incorporating a hybrid warfare strategy. And these, the following capabilities are some of the hybrid war strategy where Russia can employ, such as information operations. Russia can utilize new outlets or funding other outlets in the other country to influence the objectivity of information to serve Russia's interests. cyber, like hacking other countries to steal information or influencing democratic processes, such as the 2016 US election. The use of proxies by utilizing fractions that are in line with Russia's interests. We can see this use in the case of Ukraine. And Russia can also use economic and political influences. And finally, the use of conventional and nuclear weapons. Next, I will hand it over to Theo to talk about China.
Hi, everyone. I'm Theodore, and I just want to share with you a little bit more about the Chinese perspective. As you all know, they kind of adopt a assured retaliation posture with no first use, and they have been shown to be very uncooperative. So this is just a little bit to help us understand China, because that's part of strategy as well. You got to know your enemy and yourself, or your adversary and yourself. So you have to take a look at a few reasons why they're so uncooperative, such as the history, the culture, politics, and military engagements between these two countries. So the short answer is that, because of these factors, we should not engage them, but I'll carry on in the next slide. Why? Okay, so China has always been an isolationist culture. One of the biggest manifestations of this culture was the building and upgrading of the Great Wall since 220 BC to keep foreign invaders and so-called barbarians out. So they don't colonize so much as Europe. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the narrative is this: they were prospering for several millennia, at least according to the Chinese perspective, until the West came in the form of the Opium War, where China lost Hong Kong to the British in the 1800s. And next slide, please. So it is because of these two Opium Wars that it was, and of course the colonization by the West of China, that it was seen as a great humiliation of China. And you can see that there was very adverse reaction in the 1900s due to the Western colonization in the form of the Boxer Rebellion, and of course there are other conflicts as well. Use this as your context for today's South China Sea and military disputes. And you can see that the West can be looked upon from the Chinese perspective as an antagonist or imperialist, because that was the history of the West. So next slide, please. So there's this whole thing to try and make China great again. But because of the history between China and the West, and then you have this curtailing of China's influence by the West. It is often seen by China that the West likes to press their thumb down on China to suppress them. So, and then you have this South China Sea dispute where US and China are frequently having conflicts in the Taiwan, and US supports Hong Kong, which kind of angers China because of course, the history. There's this trade war that's going on, the whole saga of mutual expulsion of journalists, and of course, this COVID-19 blame game. All these factors kind of make it difficult to bring China to the negotiating table. And this is in addition to China not wanting to allow weapon inspections in the first place. And of course, you have other strategic considerations as well. But this kind of boils down why you might not want to engage China at this moment, and it will continue to be difficult in the future. So next slide, please. Yeah, I'll just pass this over to Max to continue on this question of the US credibility. Thanks.
Hi, this is Max Wallace, and one of the parts of international relations is obviously talking about credibility and delivery. And what we have to consider is that between the power vacuums that have recently been created and our new isolationist policies are contributing to unreliability and some instability in our strategic positions. Recent strategic moves by the US can no longer assume that the American goals and the world's security goals are aligned. So on the next slide, we have to start with the Ukrainian border crisis. As he mentioned, Russia is using the conquering of Crimea to extend their sphere of influence. However, the Ukrainian border was created and the territorial claims certified in 1994 between the US, Russia, and the Ukraine as part of the memorandum that convinced Ukraine to give up their new nuclear weapons and sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, this was reaffirmed in 2009 when the START Treaty expired, that Russia and the US under Obama would continue to recognize the territorial sovereignty of the Ukraine. And that didn't happen. So that's going to have to be something that's considered as this is all going forward. But on the next slide, we bring us to slightly more recent developments, which is that under the leadership of Donald Trump, our position in the world and our relationships have degraded a little bit. Some of the greatest hits are on the right. You can pick your own tweet if you want to. But if we go to the next slide, I've just picked up 3 that we can consider. The first one is a 12-nation trade deal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that was worked on for 15 years. The US signed it in 2016. Trump administration immediately withdrew. And what happened is it went into force anyway, covering 13% of global GDP, which has no trade interest with the United States. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we've all known about, the deal with Iran to denuclearize, which didn't continue. But the most interesting one for a strategic perspective is NATO. In 2017, Trump stated that NATO is obsolete, worthless, what's it for? Will the US meet its Article 5 conventions? But then in 2019, Trump stated at a NATO conference that it is stronger than ever and then promptly left before the photography. In 2018, a survey was taken and 7 EU member states, including 4 of which are in NATO, found that the US deterrence, the nuclear security, was less credible as a result of recent US action. And indeed, NATO has just started off a new reflection process committee with the aims to strengthen the political ties in between the NATO nations. And notably, the US co-chair of this committee is not serving in the administration, so there may or may not be some messaging in this one. If we go to the next slide, we can see some very recent developments in this. The first one is the Treaty on Open Skies, which Secretary Pompeo has openly considered the withdrawal from. It's been in force for 60 years. The US gets far more benefit from it than the Russians do. And if the US withdraws, we're going to rely on satellites and technical means. Then we go to our recent deployment of the W-76-2, the new low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead. It's the answer to the escalate to de-escalate strategy as stated in a Department of State technical paper. But that immediately led to the May 1st commentary by the second largest political party in the German government, where they are openly considering not buying dual-capable aircraft to replace those that they currently have, which would mean nuclear weapons will no longer be forward-based for NATO in Germany. And as a result of that, the cite from the governmental representative directly is, the United States no longer sees nuclear weapons as instruments of deterrence, but means of waging war, and the escalation risk of nuclear weapons in German soil has thus become unmanageable. And so that's something to consider, that during any new extension of the treaty, the next version will have to consider the impact of and the shape of our defense agreements with our allies with regards to their strategic interests, but they may not necessarily be immediately aligned with the US anymore. And now we're going to go over to Maddie, who's going to tell you about some coronavirus implications. Maddie, are you there? We can't hear you.
All right, Maddie might be experiencing some technical difficulties, so I will go ahead and take over the conclusion. Coronavirus has presented several impacts for all countries involved in nuclear weapons. And this global instability and uncertainty puts lots of pressure on countries to then kind of solve these new emerging problems. And so it's another kind of bullet point towards extending the treaty as it stands, as opposed to writing a new one. As the economic group touched on, the US has budgeted a lot of money to expanding its nuclear arsenal and updating it, modernizing it over the next 20 years or 10 years. And with the advent of the coronavirus, those resources will need to be redirected towards more domestic interests with the United States economy. Furthermore, coronavirus has reduced the ability to keep up with new start inspections. The other impact is the kind of concept of hybrid war, and along with the US's goal of nuclear deterrence to kind of hedge against this uncertain future. Lower yield weapons, they have a lower barrier of use, a lower threshold of use. And that's something that needs to be considered that isn't currently in the New START treaty, but is something that needs to be better defined, better established, so that it can be included in the future. But until that point, it makes sense to extend from a U.S. military and strategic perspective, as opposed to
Okay,
a new treaty. Go ahead,
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Having technical difficulties, couldn't unmute myself on a cell line. But anyway, so if we talk about U.S. investments and investments in low-yield weapons and hybrid war, because we just talked about COVID and everything the U.S. is investing in is very important right now. But if we invest in low-yield nuclear weapons, which is part of the U.S. modernization plan, then you have a lot more flexibility and a lower threshold for use in international situations, which makes first use for the nuclear option much more probable and boosts uncertainty. Combined with a modern buffet of weapons of mass destruction and the other instability provided by COVID, we collectively need to find a more stable ground for our healthier international relationships so that every party can read each other and interact with less risk of nuclear use. If you could go to the conclusion slide, please. These facts and others presented by my team members have led us to the following conclusions from a military strategy standpoint. Firstly, we would like to extend New START. This would give us the time we need to update our arsenal, as well as supporting the stability and welfare of our international partners and using a form of palatable treaty verification to ensure what we need to know as quickly as we can return to the inspections that were put on pause under COVID. And I say palatable because some of the zero-knowledge verification technologies might end up being too complicated for nation states to be willing to accept without, paranoia of the other party cheating. That said, New START also doesn't cover for a lot of these technologies, and we can't immediately replace New START because new treaties effectively take years to craft. Secondly, we do not support bringing China into New START because they, again, don't have a lot of weapons, so the point of the treaty is kind of defeated when you look at the 1,500 warheads versus 200 to 300. And beyond not having many weapons, as Theo explained, they aren't willing to come to the table and we would likely have to make steep sacrifices to get them here, given the new international tension. Finally, we also believe that future types of war will require different agreements that have a lot of different and non-nuclear components to really hammer out. So if we circle back to extending New START, we would need more time and a number of different treaties to actually solve all of these components of hybrid warfare. And some of these aspects may never actually have any formal New START style treaties. So the group believes that we should limit New START to what it covers and avoid making any additions or amendments to encompass other weapons types that would threaten the current option to extend the bill instead of being outright rejected. That concludes all we have to say in this presentation. Thank you for your time, and if there is time, we'll still take questions.
Hi, we're going to now turn it over to the technical group. Just a reminder that we are at the 3:12 mark, so we have 18 minutes left. So if there's any way for a little bit moving things along a little bit quicker, that might be necessary. Thank you.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. We'd like to present a technical analysis of New START and possible mechanisms for moving forward with expanding or extending this treaty. My name is James Parks, and I'll talk about the current treaty in place. New START really focuses on limiting and reduction measures of the strategic nuclear arsenal of the US and Russia. It does so by categorizing these into two groups: deployed weapons, those capable of first strike, and non-deployed weapons not capable of first strike. And with these, it sets a strict limit of 700 deployed delivery devices composed of ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers, and 1,550 deployed warheads, and a total of 800 launchers. Note that the launchers count includes both deployed and non-deployed launchers. It is important to recognize that this means that non-deployed delivery devices and non-deployed warheads are not limited under New START. Also, both countries, as can be seen from the plot on the right, met these limits by February 2018. New START also offers a series of verification measures. First, it does this by a self-reporting mutual database with a strategic missile arsenal information. It also has a provision for the telemetry sharing of 5 strategic nuclear tests per year. Third, it requires both parties consent to the monitoring by the other party through national technical means, as long as these technical means are lawful under international law. And then fourth, and most importantly, it allows for 18 short notice on-site inspection of strategic nuclear arsenal facilities, 10 of these at facilities with deployed arms and 8 at facilities with non-deployed arms. There are various pros and cons to the renewal of New START that various people have brought forth. Those who support it really like to emphasize that there's really no downside to renewal. And they bring this up by the fact that at the very end of the treaty, there's actually a clause which says that the treaty can automatically be replaced by any new treaty that is formed. Thus, by renewing the treaty, there's actually no hindrance to future negotiations with, between the US and Russia. They also argue that by renewing the treaty, you keep some sort of limits in place. This is super important right now because New START is the only remaining bilateral treaty between the US and Russia for arms limits. Thus, if the treaty were to lapse without a new treaty being present, there would be no limits in place. Third, they note that the treaty actually acts as a mechanism for key intelligence gathering, in particular through that mutual database and through those inspections mentioned earlier, which they argue cannot be replaced by traditional intelligence gathering methods. However, with these in mind, there are particular criticisms that we really have to consider. The first of these is that the treaty is by far not comprehensive. It only addresses strategic weapons, and it only addresses Russia and the US. Thus, short-range weapons, intermediate-range weapons, etc., and other powers such as China are not limited under this treaty. Additionally, it may not limit all new technologies that are emerging. And Russia has recognized that they are currently undergoing extreme technological development within their nuclear arsenal. And so it could theoretically be possible that Russia could bypass the New START treaty through some of these technologies. Third, many critics of the treaty like to note that Russia has a dishonest history when it comes to nuclear arms agreements. And most recently, this has presented itself through the INF Treaty, where they were known to have been violating the treaty for a couple of years. And as a result, the US withdrew from this treaty in fall of 2019. Thank you.
Okay, hi, I'm Revathi, and I'm going to be walking through the analysis of the US stockpile, particularly looking at strategic weapons. Next slide. So again, with the US, we have a nuclear triad that encompasses the Air Force, sea-launched weapons, and land-based weapons. And I'll go into detail about each of the components of each part of the triad. Next slide. So within the Air Force, the US currently has 20 B-2 bombers in their stockpile. These are able to carry nuclear bombs, but they cannot carry cruise missiles. And they are also designed as low observable aircrafts, originally built to evade Soviet defense systems. They're capable of attack missions of up to 50,000 feet and can fly to any part of the world within hours, which makes them pretty flexible. On the other hand, we also have 40 B-52 bombers that are able to deliver a range of conventional arms, including missiles. And they have an unfueled combat range of about 8,000 kilometers. Bombers are a key component of the US nuclear force, given their dexterity and flexibility in delivering nuclear weapons. The Air Force has actually proposed downsizing the B-52 fleet several times, arguing that air-launched cruise missiles are more effective and more efficient than they had been in the past, but Congress denied the requests given the B-52's use in striking during times of war. Next slide. So looking at the sea-launched part of the triad, we have submarines. So the US submarine fleet includes 14 Trident submarines, each of which can carry 20 Trident II missiles. The Navy actually converted 4 of the Trident submarines to SSGN, which stands for Ship Submersible Guided Nuclear Submarines, each of which can carry 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles, as well as up to 100 special ops troops and their respective mini submarines. Since the fleet not only carries weapons but also troops, it remains a formidable presence in international waters and contributes to nuclear deterrence. And the 4 SSGN submarines are expected to be in service through the mid-2020s. Next, please. And lastly, we have our land base. So in our land-based force, the US has 400 Minuteman III ICBMs, each with 1 warhead. Each missile was originally deployed with 3 for a total of 1,500 warheads on 500 launchers, and that number has since been decreased to 1 warhead. They have a max range of 13,000 kilometers, and they were the first US missile to be fitted with MIRVs, multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. And with Minuteman III's, launch crews are able to communicate with the President and the Secretary of Defense instantaneously. However, should command capability between the launch center and the missile be lost, an Airborne Launch Control Center aircraft automatically assumes control of the missile. So its advanced technology and fail-safe precautions make the Minuteman III an extremely valuable asset. Next, please. So looking at modernization programs, there have been a lot of different efforts to modernize all aspects of the triad for decades. But in order to maintain credible deterrence, the US needs to continue investing in upgrades to all existing weapons and delivery systems. So particularly in the Air Force, with the Minuteman III, there have been several initiatives in the past, including propulsion replacement, tuning the retargeting ability, and modernizing the Minuteman fuse, among others. In 2002, the Air Force began exploring the idea of a GBSD program, which stands for Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent, to replace the Minuteman III. And this is a more comprehensive integrated weapon system capable of adapting to a wide variety of situations with better performance against modern defenses. And while this enables more robust defense of the country, it is worth considering what the implications of a more advanced weapon system for the US might be on other countries' nuclear programs. With submarines, the current class of submarines are called the Ohio class, and the Navy plans to retire them beginning in 2027. And the Navy is currently working on designing the new Columbia submarine class. They're also working on procuring a life extension program for the existing D5 missiles aboard those Ohio submarines, since those will be the first deployed on the Columbia submarines. And these subs will have 16 launch tubes, down from the current 24 launch tubes that were reduced to 20 in compliance with New START. And because New START reductions require fewer missiles per sub, the Navy states that it can have more submarines, arguing that the total number of warheads allowed under the restrictions can be spread across more submarines. Okay, next slide.
All right, hello, I am Richie. I will be providing a short analysis of Russia. Next slide. So as shown before, the amount of warheads and launchers were effectively decreased by New START. However, the individual worth of a single launcher is much greater than it was previously. So 2 examples you'll see there are part of the Russia's modernization program, which is on the next slide. So large-scale modernization began in the late 1990s, but it was plagued by financial issues causing the delays in the development of next-generation missiles and other delivery vehicles. So most of these new nuclear systems are either recently joined the force or will do so in the coming years. An image of this is seen to the right. Many of these weapons have improved range and stealth, focusing on penetrating American missile defense systems. But on the next slide, we see a larger problem with Russia is their non-strategic or tactical weapons. There's no real hard definition as to what a non-strategic nuclear weapon is, but they are generally shorter range weapons. A shift in Russia's nuclear doctrine has led to the development of lower yield weapons. Russia is developing these in order to use in a regional conflict against NATO or China. And as mentioned in a quote to the right there by Lieutenant General Robert Ashley, these weapons are held as secrets, so the amount and capabilities are all speculation to us, but we believe they're between 1,800 and 2,000 warheads. They're also a part of the modernization program. They're having greater yields, greater stealth, and lower yields for more ready use. Issues have arose in the past. It was mentioned in 2014, a violation of the INF Treaty was caused by one of these non-strategic weapons, the 9M279. So these have proven to be issues for us in the past. Pass it over to China.
Hi everyone, I'm Massimo. I was in charge of analyzing the Chinese nuclear arsenal. Next slide. So first off, the Chinese have a very clearly stated no first use policy and do not have access to a complete nuclear triad. But what they do have is around 125 land-based missiles with ranges well up to 13,000 kilometers, which is within reach of the United States. In the sea, they have 4 SSBNs, each armed with 12 SLBMs. And in total, they have roughly 250 warheads, although there are some concerns regarding this number that I'll talk about later. In general, the Chinese strive to maintain a small yet still very capable nuclear force in order to respond to nuclear threats against them, and also to provide some credibility towards political posturing and military maneuvers of their own. To that end, they have outfitted their small arsenal with some extremely advanced weapons. One such weapon is the DF-17, which was actually debuted in October of last year. This missile is one of the first in the world to actually have hypersonic glide capabilities, and additionally has been noted by US intelligence as performing extreme maneuvers and evasive actions in midair. So this is a missile that can travel at speeds of up to Mach 5 and also actually avoid defense systems on the way to its target. Another missile of note is the DF-26, which is a much larger missile, yet still precise enough to hit moving aircraft carriers on the sea anywhere within 4,000 kilometers. So while the Chinese may have a small arsenal, they do have very technologically advanced weapons at their disposal. Next slide. Additionally, they have been investing heavily into the modernization of their older systems with a very heavy emphasis on updates to include MIRV capabilities and also to increase the accuracy of these older missiles. It's these MIRV updates that are the greatest cause for concern regarding their warhead stockpile, because in order to actually supply all these new missiles with up to 10 warheads each, the Chinese would need far, far greater than their stated 250 warheads. So this leads to some speculation that they are either misreporting their stockpile numbers or very soon will begin to ramp up production of warheads. Additionally, the Chinese are spending a significant amount of time and money on entirely new technologies. They're building a new super long-range ICBM with a range of 15,000 kilometers, which would actually make it the longest range missile in the world. They're also building a completely new SSBN and an SLBM to go with it, although very little is known about that. And finally, they're even in the late testing stages of a new strategic bomber and ALBM to finally complete their nuclear triad. With that, we'll move on to technical recommendations.
Hi, I'm Sam Harrisshoe, and I was tasked with formulating the research of my group into concise technical recommendations. Next slide, please. So our first recommendation is to include non-strategic, often also known as tactical weapons in the treaty. And our justification for that, first of all, is somewhat similar, piggybacking off of military strategy groups' idea of a buffet of nuclear options. The more options you have, the more flexible you are with implementing nuclear weapons, that lowers the threshold for nuclear war. But another part of the threshold being lowered is the location of these weapons on the battlefield removes them from central command and makes it more likely that the chain of command utilized in detonating one of these weapons is somewhat abbreviated. which also lowers the thresholds. These weapons are also more easily mass produced due to their lower yields. It requires typically less fissile material, but it also requires less sophisticated hardware and software. Another issue with tactical or non-strategic weapons is China's arsenal, and much of Russia's arsenal is thought to be composed of non-strategic weapons, which would make non-strategic weapons matter a lot for any sort of bi or trilateral treaty. These weapons are no longer captured by INF because that's no longer implemented. And in order to implement this kind of change, the term non-strategic would need to be hammered out, defined better. Next slide, please. Our second recommendation is to include China in the treaty. I want to acknowledge that China is thought to have a relatively small arsenal compared to Russia and US. One author of paper research on this topic argued that, and this is paraphrasing, that including China in the New START treaty would either cause an increase in China's arsenal to the levels of US or Russia, or pave the way for that increase, or it would require US and Russia to decrease their arsenals to the levels of China to be fair for the treaty. But the main issue at play here is one of transparency. China has had a poor record of transparency, as you can see from the images I put on this slide. Those are examples of poor transparency. So there is no way to know that China's arsenal is indeed what they've said it is. And one great way to enforce transparency would be to include them in this treaty. Next slide, please. Our final recommendation is to include the weird weapons, upcoming unconventional weapons, whatever you want to call it. These weapons don't typically fit into the traditional categories and the categories listed in START treaty. Bombers, ICBMs, SLBMs. There are some examples I included on this page. The examples are 9M730, I can't pronounce it, starts with a B, Project Pluto and Status 6. Project Pluto and 9M are examples of nuclear-powered cruise missiles that utilize the heat from a reactor to fuel a ramjet engine. And the issue with these weapons is they have essentially unlimited range, or theoretically unlimited range, because of their nuclear propulsion. They can stay in the air for extended periods of time. And they can also hold large payloads with multiple warheads that can be used in a strategic manner, but they're not covered in the treaty. Another example of weapon here is Status 6, which is pictured below. This is basically a Russian drone submarine, unmanned, that has a huge range in the tens of thousands of nautical miles. It has that huge range because it's a nuclear propelled submarine, and it can deliver up to 100 megaton blast, which is designed to apparently generate a tsunami to devastate coastal cities of the enemy. Definitely has a strategic significance, so should be included in the treaty. On my next slide, it's just some references for the images, and then next slide. Any questions?
I'm just going to real quick butt in. We are currently at time for this presentation. We do have the recommendation group to go next, but I just am checking to make sure if we need to adjust because of any potential time constraints.
And I think we're okay to go. We have like 5 slides, so I think we'll be pretty quick.
All right. All right. Feel free to proceed and let me know when to move to the next slide.
Okay, thank you. I will be as quick as possible. Hello, everyone. This is Jun Ronglin, and we are the recommendation group. Next slide, please. Yeah, so today we brought you the final recommendation on the New START Treaty, which is to extend the treaty for 5 years, and there should be a new bilateral treaty being negotiated during the extension between Russia and the United States. And in this presentation, we are going to go through our analysis based on the information provided by each group and exploring all possible options, comparing the pros and cons of bilateral and multilateral extension and non-extension options. And we will give our final recommendation based on the principle of maintaining peace, reducing the arsenal size and military threat for both sides. And we want to carefully achieve this goal through a low cost and low risk approach. Next slide, please.
So the reason we are all here today is to discuss the fate of the New START Treaty. The treaty is set to expire in February 2021, at which time it can be extended for another 5 years, or it can be allowed to expire. Also, I'm Clara, by the way, sorry. So our job as the recommendation team was to explore the options available to policymakers regarding the fate of New START. Before going into the policy options considered, I'm just gonna set the political landscape a bit. So these two nations had and continue to possess the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. Thus, over the past 5 decades, the US and the Soviet Union, or the US and Russia, have had several agreements to limit or reduce their nuclear arsenals. Each treaty the nations signed on to signified an interest of both nations in reducing their stockpiles. But as we learned from the historical team, throughout the histories of these treaties, elections and military maneuvers have occurred, and constant back and forth negotiations have plagued arms treaties between the two nations. So once New START expires in 2021, it is possible there will be a breakdown in the arms control system, as New START is the last significant arms control treaty between the two nations. So the scenarios we as the recommendation team explored are a prolongation of New START with either an expansion into a multilateral treaty to include China, or just extending it but keeping it a bilateral treaty. And the second option was an elimination of an arms control treaty. So we let New START expire and either work towards creating a new updated treaty, or we just no longer have any arms control treaty for now between the two nations. So several avenues were explored before making a final recommendation on how to move forward on arms control negotiations with Russia and possibly with China. And our recommendation relied heavily on the information we were given from the other teams, each providing their own perspective. Next slide, please.
This is Haley Williams. So here we will outline some key considerations for our recommendation. As mentioned, the first part of our recommendation involved deciding if the treaty should be bilateral or multilateral moving forward. So from our analysis and looking at the studies performed by each of the groups, it was found that a bilateral treaty should include these 3 elements. Firstly, further numerical reductions in the number of weapons and delivery vehicles would be a positive step towards a less nuclear charged world stage. It's notable that from the economic group's analysis, this would only cause modest financial savings relative to the size of the US defense budget, but a numerical reduction is a clear priority for an ongoing and future arms control agreements. Second, a new bilateral treaty should include an expanded definition of strategic weapons and inclusion of tactical weapons. Since Russia is continuing to develop weapons, it's relevant to limit the imbalance of weapon types. And economically, this could incur costs if there are stricter technical inspections or modifications made to existing weapons, yet these would likely be minor. And lastly, it's crucial that the treaty emphasizes communication and data sharing and inspections among the US and Russia. Promotion of an open relationship, as well as the continuation of physical inspections, are critical to the other key elements of numerical reduction and the inclusion of new weapon systems. A multilateral treaty option with the inclusion of China was also explored. Including China in the treaty could bolster US allies, especially in the South China Sea, where China's presence has increased. A treaty with China would also be valuable for broader arms control among states and could possibly shed some light on Chinese nuclear posture, which is not very transparent at the moment. but that leads to some of the cons of a multilateral treaty. China has a small arsenal and as well as a no first use policy, but they also have a rather vague stance. And a treaty could be helpful in bringing them to the table, but there are little motivations for them to do so. And New START is not clearly the best step in the direction of arms control for China. A hallmark of the US-Russia treaties is now numerical equality among weapons and delivery vehicles. And as we know, China's arsenal is nowhere near the size. So additionally, negotiating a comprehensive treaty which serves the long-term goals of the three parties before February does not really seem feasible. So given these considerations and recognizing that the technical team offered a differing opinion, our team has unanimously recommended that the new treaty should be bilateral, and there should be other steps taken first to promote transparency and communication with China, but a continuation of New START is not the appropriate platform for this agenda. Next slide. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Chai, and I'm going to be talking about some key considerations on whether we should extend or don't extend the START. First, I'll start off with extend considerations. The global defensive climate has been altered due to the rapid evolving COVID situation. Under its current plan, the U.S. is expected to peak in modernization of their nuclear arsenal in the late 20s and early 30s. There is a possibility that funding for pandemic relief will decrease funds allocated to modernizing the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal in the future, which could have negative strategic implications on the global scale. Testing has ceased inspections for all nuclear powerhouses due to the COVID situation. This has potential to increase tensions between parties due to the inability to verify compliance of diplomatic agreements between the parties. And then this narrows the US's choice in controlling the global nuclear climate to diplomatic means. So it's preferred that we extend the treaty. Also, the COVID situation has forced both Russia and the US to allocate future funds for national and security reasons. For these reasons, we recommend extension of the treaty. The U.S. has a larger benefit in the extension in this case because we are not as fully modernized in our nuclear weapons arsenal as Russia. Furthermore, any deviation from an extended arms treaty with Russia is counterintuitive to U.S. nuclear policy, which is focused on disarmament and non-proliferation. Not extending the treaty will damage foreign relations with allies as well. So, extending the treaty shows Russia that we're willing to negotiate and will perhaps open doors for a future in arms agreements relating to Russia's non-nuclear capabilities, which is something we're very concerned about, the possibility of a hybrid warfare. And some considerations to not extend, for the time being, as I mentioned earlier, because of the COVID situation, we're unable to verify compliance of any agreement by either party physically. We still have satellite and drone technology to do that, but inspections are subsided. Delaying the extension could give US the time to create a more encompassing arms deal that checks Russia's hybrid warfare capabilities, kind of using it as leverage in a sense. This will also perhaps give us leverage over China in terms of creating an overall all-encompassing deal that involves all the nuclear powerhouses. However, not extending the treaty could also have drastic immediate effects on our allies, but the benefits are still there. With that said, we highly recommend extending the treaty. Next slide.
All right, this is Kaylee Kinnett. So just to reiterate and conclude, our team recommends that we extend the New START treaty for 5 years. And so this will allow a continuity of arms control, which will ensure safety and stability while a new treaty is drafted. It will also facilitate continuous dialogue between the United States and Russia, which will allow for trust building, future talks, and negotiation for the next iteration of New START. This will also allow the inspection and information sharing regimes to stay operational, which will provide continuous monitoring over the 5-year extension period and a smoother transition into the future verification regime. We also recommend that the new treaty that is negotiated during this extension will be a bilateral treaty. We ultimately decided that adding China in a new treaty meant to take the place of New START would add unnecessary complications and make negotiation more difficult. Maybe there are some legitimate security concerns surrounding the Chinese nuclear arsenal, but that would be something best left addressed in another treaty. The new bilateral treaty should include further numeric reductions. So we've met the numeric reductions in the first iteration of New START, so why not further decrease those numbers? It should also be expanded to include the new delivery systems developed by Russia, like Skyfall, the nuclear-powered cruise missile, and Poseidon, the nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed unmanned underwater vehicle. It should be noted that Avangard and Sarmat are both already included in the current iteration of New START. And even Avangard has already been shown to US inspectors. Russia has stated that they are both included in the current treaty, and under Article 5, that means that the US and Russia can discuss how to specifically include those in the current iterations, but those would be included if we extended the current New START treaty for the 5 years. So we would be allowed to discuss those things during the extension. Nonetheless, the US should ensure that both of those systems are also included in the next iteration of the treaty. So Russia has expressed its willingness to extend New START and negotiate a new arms control agreement. So far, the US has remained hesitant, but it should be noted that in terms of the things we've evaluated for what should be included in a bilateral treaty, there's a lot that's being asked for Russia to give up. So when the United States enters negotiations for the next treaty, they should expect, in exchange for the restrictions being asked of Russia, for perhaps the reduction of US missile defenses and conventional strike weapons, as well as the removal of US short-range weapons deployed in Europe. So overall, extending New START for 5 years and negotiating a new treaty in the interim will maintain global stability, maintain communication between the US and Russia, and allow a smooth transition into a new arms control treaty. That's all we have. So thank you, everyone, for sticking around.
And so with that, that concludes the total presentation. Thank you again. And if there's any questions, we can proceed with that. Otherwise, that's everything.
So can you hear me? This is Michael Knopf.
We can hear you, Michael.
So I know we're way over time, but just a quick question. In some of the presentations, there's mentioning a consideration of other countries besides China, but none of them were mentioned or cited. Were there any specific countries that were given any detailed analytical attention besides China? No? Okay.
Hi, this is Max Wallace from the Strategic Military Team. We considered a variety of nations, including Poland, Germany, South Korea, and whether they would be more or less likely to develop nuclear weaponry, whether there was a treaty in place or not. But ultimately, we didn't really come to a solid conclusion, so we decided to leave it out.
These are the proliferation questions about non-nuclear states that could go nuclear. What about other current nuclear states? India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea. They were not considered for this next round, is that right?
We did not consider them in the strategic, no.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Well, this is Michael again. I can jump in then and just thank everyone for a terrific job. Very detailed analysis. We really look forward to reading the report to get into the details of these issues. And I think you've done a great job, and we're very proud of you. Professor Van Bibber, would you like to add or comment on this?
I will just second Professor Knox's comments. It was a tremendous presentation. It is, of course, the situation we're in is everybody being in lockdown and dispersed obviously put some impediments to full communication, which what I think have made the overall thing, the overall presentation, give it a little bit more coherence in terms of the conclusions that we heard from the various groups and then the final roll-up. But that was completely understandable, and we actually understood that was going to happen. On the whole, I think it was a wonderful presentation. I learned a great deal. It's a very thorny question, what to do. My own opinion is that I think you got it right in terms of what the recommendation should be, which I think would be a limited and realistic renewal, bilateral renewal. It leaves significant problems still on the table. I think, had we greater time for discussion, I would have liked to have probed in what the groups think about in terms of reports of sort of covert low yield testing going on in both Russia and China, what intentions that signals, if they are true. But on the whole, I think the history of arms control has been the art of the possible. And I think I think your recommendations have achieved that. I think you've arrived to that place, the art of the possible. So yeah, no further questions because I think the hour is quite late, and we'll probably convene for today.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. Have a good rest of semester, summer, and onward.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before I'm booted off, I want to apologize for my laptop dying and me having to call in on my phone. That was unexpected, but the bright side of things is that I learned if you want to speak from a phone, all you need to do is press *6 to unmute yourself.
Ah,
great.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you for your understanding, and I'm sorry for the inconvenience. Have a great
All
day
right.
and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Are we sticking on, the four of us?
Or we can just go to a new line. What do you want to do, Mansuk?
We can stay here.
Okay.
I'm gonna stop recording.
2 minutes here.